Welcome again, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce today's 19V speaker. That is Anna Dżabagina from the University of Warsaw. And her topic is Two Double Lives, 1848 novels by Karolina Pavlova and Narcyza Żmichowska, and the emergence of Sapphic Modernism in the territories of the Russian Empire. And welcome to our subsednik, who is Julia Manhartz from the University of Oxford. So we'll go directly to the talk, and then Julia will say a few words, and we'll open up to discussion. So Anna, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, firstly, and good afternoon to all of present guests. I will share my screen because I have a small presentation, but I will give you a notice that it will be very uneventful. Just I think that it will be still better background for the talk than just my talking head for the straight 40 minutes. So okay, let me know if it's opened properly. Yeah, okay. My today's presentation is actually a part of a larger project entitled Sapphic Modernism in Women's Writing from the Territories of the Russian Empire, in which I am investigating an interconnected transnational phenomenon of Sapphic modernism. That is, in my understanding, this kind of literature that is evidence of a search for a new language or new strategies to express female same-sex desires, identities, and experiences in Polish, Russian and Ukrainian literature that was created on the territories of the Russian Empire. The category of the Russian Empire gives me both geographical and temporal boundaries, and selecting Polish, Russian, and Ukrainian female writers from particular regions of the empire creates a unique comparative area that allows to ask questions on the relationship between literary works and the conditions for expressing non-heteronormative experiences and identities with the variation of the writer's location within the same imperial structure. And each of the three selected cultural spaces represents a different variant of locational specifics influencing the ability of queer expression. Although my today's talk refers only to two of them, I believe it illustrates precisely the benefits of employing a perspective like this to a research of women's writings of the period. And finally, based on the interpretation of Żmichowska's novel mainly, and adding the context of Silver Age era women poets to this transnational cultural parataxis, I will try to highlight the subversive potential of Pavlova's work and its impact on the emergence of Sapphic modernism on the Russian Empire territories. Okay, so hopefully I won't be incorrect to assume that Karolina Pavlova doesn't need an extensive introduction in front of this audience. Instead, I will focus on presenting some common denominators between the two writers. Both Pavlova and Żmichowska got a fairly good education for a woman at the time. Pavlova, of course, thanks to the support of her father, Karol Jenisch, who was a professor of physics and chemistry at the School of Medicine and Surgery in Moscow. Żmichowska, on the other hand, was a student first at the Zuzanna Wilczyńska's pension, and later she graduated from Governess Institute led by Klementyna Tańska-Hoffmanowa. But most importantly, she had a chance for extensive self-education after becoming a governess for a noble house of Zamoyski and moving to Paris in 1838, when most of her time she spent in the Bibliothèque Nationale and also attended meetings at the French Academy. Trajectories of their literary reputation also seem alike. They both belong to the generation that doesn't yet consider writing as a profession and a way to make a living suitable for women. And despite that, both Pavlova and Żmichowska started writing at a relatively young age and witnessed a period of acknowledgement in the mid-century. And both of them got almost completely forgotten by the end of their lives. While Żmichowska was lucky enough to have a group of devoted friends and pupils who tried to restore her legacy after the writer's passing, Pavlova was labeled as unprogressive in the 60s, and by the 70s she fell into oblivion. She spent the last decades of her life in a voluntary exile in Dresden and died almost unnoticeably. Sorry, not used to read English. Both writers had a brief renaissance at the beginning of the 20th century. Pavlova's work was unearthed and promoted by Russian symbolists, and as mentioned above, she became a prominent figure for women poets of that time. And in 1915, Valery Brusov published a 2-volume edition of her work. Meanwhile, Żmichowska was rediscovered in the late 20s by Tadeusz Bojżeleński, who started a prolific campaign to bring her writings to his contemporaries' attention. Renowned critic published several essays on Żmichowska in major press outlets, and most importantly in the influential literary journal Wiadomości Literackie, and released new editions of her novels, above all The Hidden, which was published in 1929 in the National Library series with an extensive introduction by Bojżeleński. Yet, despite this brief renaissance, so to speak, it took decades and relentless efforts of feminist scholars to fully establish and recognize the significance of Żmichowska's and Pavlova's writing for literary history. And last but not least, just as Hilde Hugenboom wrote lately about Pavlova, quote, "Before Kate Chopin and Virginia Woolf, there was Karolina Pavlova," end of quote. That is actually the same with Narcyza Żmichowska. She is one of the most interesting female writers in Polish literary history. And in the second half of the 19th century, she wrote peculiar, multi-layer, often incomplete novels employing various experimental narrations. Some of her literary strategies could be easily compared to those employed by Woolf half a century later. Żmichowska was also quite a controversial figure according to the standards of her time. She never got married and supported women's freedom of choice in that regard. Moreover, Żmichowska herself was a non-heteronormative woman who had romantic relationships with other women, and was possibly the first female Polish writer who attempted to express the Sapphic experience of a woman through literature. Since we know that Pavlova, once a former pupil of Adam Mickiewicz, spoke some Polish, she could possibly read some of Żmichowska's early works. By the end of the 40s, Polish author published several volumes of poetry, and most importantly, her most acknowledged novel, Poganka, which was translated as The Hidden by Ursula Phillips and published a couple of years ago. However, it is much more plausible that the potential literary influence came from the opposite direction. Since we know that Pavlova, sorry, I have excuse me, I have repeated the same sentences. However, it is much more plausible that the potential literary influence came from the opposite direction. Ursula Phillips hinted at this possibility in her paper Authorship and Masquerade. However, while she mentioned it only marginally and described it as an interesting coincidence, I would argue that there is no coincidence whatsoever. Sorry. There are no records of Polish author admitting to knowledge of Pavlova's work, and there is a large corpus of Żmichowska's correspondence published throughout the years that could have accounted for that. However, one could safely assume that living in the Congress Kingdom of Poland, or in Przywislański Kraj, as it was called from the Moscow perspective, Żmichowska would have easy access to the newly published Russian literature and press, covering reviews of the literary novelties from the empire, even if she wouldn't be eager, as many of her contemporaries, to disclose her interest in colonizers' literary export, particularly not long after the trauma of November Uprising and during the period of increased exertions of Russification. When Pavlova published A Double Life in 1848, she was at the height of her fame, as Diane Green points out. Moreover, she was among the very few female writers acknowledged in Russian literature of that time. The novel itself was noticed by the most important literary journals of the period and even praised by the anonymous reviewer of influential Savremennik, who called it, quote, original in form and in the highest degree remarkable in content. End of quote. In these circumstances, it would be almost impossible for Żmichowska to overlook A Double Life, as a novel concerning a woman's fate in a patriarchal society written by her female peer. Nevertheless, it could not be a coincidence that in the same year that Pavlova's Двойная жизнь came to light, Żmichowska started working on a manuscript of a novel entitled Dwoiste, życie, especially since the word Dwoiste is actually not a neutral or natural sounding choice in the Polish language, which in this case would be podwójne for double, for example. The story of Żmichowska's novel is intriguing by itself. It was probably never finished, and in 1849, the manuscript was confiscated by the police when Żmichowska was under investigation for her alleged participation in a so-called craftsman conspiracy, whose main goal was to lead to another uprising on the wave of springtime of the nations. Although her participation in the conspiracy seems to be much less straightforward than historians tend to convey in patriotic legends of Żmichowska's biography, and the writer herself stated her criticism of the conspirators' endeavors multiple times. She was, in fact, later incarcerated for a couple of years based on these accusations. During the deposition, in which a manuscript of Dwoiste, życie was also in question, Żmichowska confessed that in the novel she portrayed herself and was about to publish it. For the rest of her life, Żmichowska stated that she lost the manuscript during that period, and she returned to the topic a decade later and wrote the novel from scratch, which was later published as Biała Róza in 1858. And in 1861, it was also incorporated into one of the volumes of collection of sort of miscellaneous writings of an anonymous female writer that she also published. However, the original manuscript resurfaced in 1929. It was discovered in the Central Archives of Historical Records in Warsaw by Zofia Szmytowa among the documents of the investigative committee that prosecuted Żmichowska in 1849. Szmytowa published found fragments in the Warsaw Scientific Society's yearbook, and to this day, as many archival resources collected in the Polish capital were destroyed during the World War II, it remains the only known copy of Dwoiste, życie. There are crucial differences between the two versions of Żmichowska's novel, arising, as I would argue, not only from the 10-year span between them, but I will return to them later in my talk. At this point, I will focus on the comparative reading of Pavlova's Двойная жизнь and Żmichowska's manuscript Dwoiste, życie. The plot of Двойная жизнь and Dwoiste, życie could be summarized in a few sentences. Pavlova's novel revolves around the everyday life of Cecily von Lindenborn, a young member of high society, raised flawlessly according to the requirements of aristocratic circles of the time by her strict mother, Vera Vladimirovna, and ready to be married off properly. In her dreams, however, the heroine is freed from the corset of her real life and comes into a contact with her inner poetic self. The synopsis of Żmichowska's novel could be even shorter. It is actually a story of one encounter between the narrator, who is also a character of the novel, and she is described only as a autorka, which is a female author in English. So the encounter between the narrator and the young millionaire Leocadia at an elegant ball in one of the sophisticated salons in Warsaw. Their meeting is brief, yet full of confusing exchanges and misunderstandings. And only after a while, Leocadia writes a letter to a narrator, explaining every awkward sentence and behavior from that night by telling narrator a story of her life and sharing a secret about her inner fantasy world. And as often in women's writings from the period, both stories' significance lies in details, not in the plot itself. The plot of both novels plays out in at least partially similar settings. Both begin at the strictly conventionalized gathering of high society. Both Żmichowska and Pavlova employ a narrator, observing those aristocratic cohorts from a distance with an ironic, critical eye, who engage in subtle yet precise ridicule of high society's shallow rituals, desires, and behaviors. Both narrators are female authors, as it turns out later at the end of the Pavlova's novel as well. The irony resonates even louder in Dwoiste, życie, since the first-person narrator reveals herself as an essential character in the scene of the ball at the beginning of the novel. She is an obvious outsider who found herself at the ball by, quote, a coincidence of various circumstances and among the social stratum quite alien to my relations, a strange mixture of arithmetic and chronology, wealth and superstition, vanity and vanity, end of quote. Since the gossip of her being a published author spread widely through Warsaw salons, and a female author for many still was a, quote, kind of menagerie oddity, end of quote, she couldn't or didn't want to mask her otherness. As she admits, quote, some of the ladies present at the ball have already heard many details about me, and among the truest are that I have cut my hair, put on a frock coat, always wear a silver watch with a white band, and shoes with spurs, end of quote. And even after the ball itself, there was another rumor claimed that the narrator or the female author came to the ball dressed in a George Sand style costume and wore a black tie, which is not a very proper decoration for a woman at this period. But instead of blending into the gathering, she chooses to stand by the side of the room, thanks to which she can observe everything while remaining invisible, as she was claiming, as if she was claiming a role of a kind of anthropologist studying the peculiar habits of an unknown indigenous tribe. From this standpoint, she sees Leocadia, a beautiful maiden dressed in a Greek-styled gown with a white rose pinned to her black hair for the first time when she's entering the room. Leocadia, similarly to Cecily from Pavlova's novel, is not only a member but also a product of this class, of her class, painfully familiar with all its rules of decency and conduct. Żmichowska's heroine mirrors Pavlova's protagonist in many ways. Both women are merely merchandise displayed at the matrimony market, both quite valuable as well, which rules are described pretty blatantly in both novels. They both have absent fathers and almost authoritarian mothers, portrayed as agents of preserving the patriarchal society's order. They meticulously try to raise their daughters properly and destroy every aspect of their characters that don't fit the silently acknowledged definition of propriety. At first glance, both mothers succeeded. Vera Vladimirovna was, quote, very proud of her daughter's successful upbringing, especially perhaps because it had been accomplished not without difficulty, because it took time and skill to destroy in her soul its innate thirst for delight and enthusiasm, end of quote. And as she later proudly admits, Cecil is exactly what I wanted to make her. Every kind of daydreaming is foreign to her, end of quote. This annihilation of her daughter's daydreaming potential is an important achievement, since Vera Vladimirovna, quote, quite justly feared any development of imagination and inspiration, those eternal enemies of propriety, end of quote. It should not come as a surprise that eternal enemies and deepest dreads of Leocadia's mother are very similar, as we learn from Leocadia's letters to the author. Apart from the dangers of imagination and daydreaming, she condemns any signs of exaltation. And exaltation for her, Leocadia's mother, is almost an umbrella term containing every imaginable sin and deviation from the norm. As the young heroine wrote, quote, bigotry, dishonesty, debauchery, everything was called exaltation among us, end of quote. And an additional weapon in her family's arsenal was ridicule. As she further confesses, in every deviation from the beaten path, in every leap beyond the daily monotony of our lives, I was laughed at so amusingly, so ridiculously, so genuinely, that in the end I had to laugh myself, and I had to believe that I was an extraordinary, hideous oddity among sane people, end of quote. Both heroines internalized their mother's rules to the point of dissociation, and Cecily and Leocadia furthermore, Cecily and Leocadia have much more inner potential, including, of course, poetic or creative potential and hidden desires than their life can facilitate. Thanks to the efficiency of her mother's upbringing, but Cecily, thanks to efficiency of her mother's upbringing, is not even consciously aware of them. She wouldn't dare to look for them, since she, quote, had been educated in fear of God and society. The Lord's commandments and the laws of propriety carried equal weight for her. To destroy either, even in thought, seems to her equally impossible and inconceivable. As if in immunity reaction, her mind develops a sacred second life for her to breathe and learn the truth about the stifled by richness of her nature, stifled by society. In this other life, unfolding within a dream, and of course it was distinctively written as a poem, not a prose, she meets a mysterious man who uncovers it to her. Quote, that prisoner of society's world, that small-souled being isn't you. They have fettered you from childhood, have swaddled your free mind, deprived you of your eternal inheritance, freedom of feeling, and the kingdom of thought. End of quote. And the tragic irony of her position is that while awake, Cecily doesn't remember any of her experiences from this idealistic asylum that she had unconsciously created for herself. Leocadia, on the other hand, develops a striking ability to daydream and live in her fantasy world while being awake, without giving any suspicion to people around her. But she does look a little bit dead doing this for the people who observe her from a side. She writes to the narrator, quote, I am what I am and what I am told to be. Did you see me, madame, that I could look like a lovely and modest young lady, that I cannot be accused of a single word, movement, or glance? And do you know what events are unfolding simultaneously in my soul? Under cover of social forms and unwavering seriousness, I created a second, inner, invisible, wild, passionate, and free life for myself. End of quote. Last but not least, both novels have come to a similar ending. Cecily is getting married, and even though conventionally it would be a happy ending in this kind of female Bildungsroman at the time, and even though Pavlova's heroine thinks she got married out of love, we as readers are painfully aware that the ending is anything but happy. Her spouse is a greedy, shallow man who bets with his friends that he will cheat on his wife as soon as possible, and the last dream Cecily had on the eve of her wedding was actually her last journey to this imagined ideal fantasy land. And Żmichowska's Dwoiste życie ends with the narrator admitting that she didn't receive any letters from Leocadia for a long time, and recently became aware that Leocadia got married to an old Hungarian aristocrat and died of tuberculosis shortly after that. Despite those many similarities, there are several significant departures from Pavlova as an inspiration in Żmichowska's manuscript. Departures that almost make one believe that if Żmichowska indeed was inspired by a Russian novel, the writing of Dwoiste życie was triggered by pain, or perhaps more accurately, anger arising from reading Pavlova's sincere, auto-reflective masterpiece. That is also why Żmichowska's project of a double life seems much more radical and even begins with an unapologetic stance of making a female author, moreover published and acknowledged female author, an openly presented narrator of the novel. In Dwoiste życie, as I mentioned before, she doesn't even have a name. She's quite simply a female author, and in Polish, it is a feminine term, autorka. And since even nowadays we have lots of very heated discussions on feminatives in Poland, imagine how radical it was in 1848. Most importantly, while Pavlova's heroine seems to be imprisoned in an abundantly hopeless situation, there is a hint of hope and promise in Żmichowska's novel. For Leocadia, meeting the narrator at the ball was a turning point in her life. As we learn from her letters, she heard about the author before. Leocadia confesses, quote, "One day, a periodical fell into my hands. Among many other things, a passage was written by a woman's pen. I read it and felt indescribable joy, for its expressions seemed to have been extracted from my heart. I fled to my room, locked myself, and thought long into the late night about what happened to me, and I was happier and happier, for in the writing woman, I finally found the sister of my soul," end of quote. And even before the actual and awkward, since Leocadia was too used to living inside her fantasy world to be able to communicate in reality, meeting at the ball, a whole separate plot of their relationship played out within her second life. Only in her letters could she unveil that in her fantasy world, she drove to the author's home first thing in the morning and greeted the stranger with words, quote, "I came to you because you write the way I think." And the author wasn't baffled by this intrusion at all. Instead, she reached out for Leocadia's hand and quote, and this is a longer quote, "Nothing has kept the two women apart ever since. Supported by each other, they walked through the world unwavering and firm, fulfilling each other's every wish at any time. Several works written together and published by them attracted widespread attention. Nurseries and factories set up in beautifully decorated farms by deed as royal seal approved for them the privilege of general respect, of complete independence. Everything and always together, the heart next to heart, thought next to thought, worship with worship, two souls, two forces, and one power." End of quote. In Leocadia's fantasy, they live a life of an unapologetic power couple, which chooses visibility and undertakes pursuits to gain recognition on their own terms instead of hiding. And what needs to be stressed is that described relationship is far from idealistic perfection. Leocadia admits that sometimes there are some bickerings and arguments between them, inevitable due to differences in their character. Still, in the end, they only make them love each other more, not less. Leocadia even dares to describe acts of physical intimacy between them. And even though they seemingly don't transgress the norms of physical contact between two close friends in the 19th century, in a broader context, it is evident that the relationship between those, quote, sisters of their choosing, end of quote, is not only romantical, but physical as well. From a reader's standpoint, Leocadia couldn't have chosen a better addressee to share her fantasy, since the author's interest in women is visible between the lines of her first description of the ball and her own conversations with a friend she was accompanied by. For example, when she sees Leocadia for the first time, she felt, quote, as she fell in love with her or intuitively know that she would write a novel from her one day, end of quote. Although parts of the novel after this portrayal of Sapphic idyll are missing, and perhaps it was destroyed, or perhaps it wasn't even written by Żmichowska herself, and the actual ending of the manuscript is quite depressing. The passage describing Leocadia's fantasy life carries out an impactful, almost revolutionary, empowering and optimistic message about the possibility of a completely different scenario for a woman's life. Crucially, it is not only the message about the potential of living outside the heteronormative matrix, but also the significance of encountering a role model. A woman courageous enough to live true to herself and pursue her vocation without the fear of becoming an old spinster or being ridiculed by the society. A role model who could become a path to salvation. Perhaps if only Cecily had met the female author, or a woman like Pavlova herself, her story could have turned completely differently. And finally, I would like to address both writers' genre and formal strategies. As Diana Green persuasively presented, gender issues affected Pavlova's use of genre in double life in two ways. Quote, first, at the purely political level, she wanted and needed acceptance by a literary establishment that consisted almost entirely of male gatekeepers, establishment in which male needs, values, and tastes defined literary genres and determined their relative status. At a second, structural level, the approved system of genres, while perfectly adequate for telling men's stories, did not answer needs of work by and about a woman and dedicated to women, end of quote. To resolve this dilemma, Pavlova invented her own hybrid form consisting of Swieckaja powieść, a cierk, a female Bildungsroman, and poetry, and I'm quoting Diana Green again, by simultaneously stretching male genres and by availing herself of less prestigious women genres, she created unique literary work in which she could tell Cecilia's story. However brilliant this strategy was, it seems that it did not resolve Pavlova's main struggles as a woman writer in the 19th century, since A Double Life was the only novel she has ever published. And even though circumstances for Polish writers at the time were slightly different, Żmichowska struggled with the same issues, which is also evident in the formal strategies of her writings. She wrote hybrid, often unfinished, multi-layer, almost postmodernist, as Grażyna Borkowska calls it, novels with hidden authorship, or used and reinvented strategies of found manuscripts, told stories within the stories, with sometimes almost paranoid covering the tracks of who's telling the story. And I would argue that Żmichowska's struggles with literary form were linked not only to her being a female author in the 19th century, but most of all to her being a lesbian female author attempting to tell a story about her own experience. Perhaps the most significant and saddest at the same time example of those struggles is the story of Dwoiste, życie manuscript becoming published Biała Róza novel 10 years later. This time it was an epistolary novel with multiple voices, mainly Kazimiera's, it was the author from the original manuscript, who tells the story of the ball encounter in her letters to the anonymous editor. At first glance, the plot of Biała Róza is very similar to its predecessor. Here, Leocadia becomes Augusta, who comes to a ball also prepared to meet Kazimiera, alleged, this time, author and translator of classical poetry. And once again, she is equipped with a Greek-styled gown and coiffure to attract Kazimiera's attention. Once again, the narrator, Kazimiera, is infatuated with a beautiful millionaire and confesses to her friend that if she were a man, she would fall madly in love with her. In Biała Róza, the encounters and conversations between heroines are perhaps even more awkward and bizarre than in the original manuscript. And later, Augusta tries to salvage their acquaintance, just like Leocadia, by sending Kazimiera letters portraying the story of her life and unveiling the secret about her inner ideal life, in which she is indeed a white rose, as Kazimiera calls her because of the hairstyle she wore. And she then took this nickname as the name for the second inner Augusta. And even if at the end of the letter, Augusta asks Kazimiera openly, quote, "Will you be with me?" End of quote, she is about to face a crushing disappointment. Instead of answering, Kazimiera passes the letters to her brother, asking for his advice. Not to mention that later she would pass the whole correspondence to the editor as well. So novel ends with the male disciplining voice of Hieronim, the brother, who tries to persuade Augusta to abandon her silly fantasies to, quote, kill a white rose within her, in order to work for ideals and society. And at the ending, we also have Kazimiera's surprised constatation that she hasn't heard from Augusta since then, since she sent her Hieronym's advices of what she should do with her life further. Differences between the two versions of Żmichowska's novel show an almost devastating process of self-censorship. However, it is necessary to highlight this process in a broader context against the timeline of Żmichowska's literary work and her reading of Pavlova's novel. Biała Róza is not the only of Żmichowska's novels that could be described as queer or Sapphic literature, or attempt of one. Here, the mentioned Poganka, the Hitan, from 1846, has to be mentioned. This most acclaimed novel of Żmichowska tells the story of a fatal affair between Benjamin and the diabolical Aspasia. Numerous interpretations of the novel prove that the male protagonist was Żmichowska's alter ego, while the whole novel was supposed to be a ciphered history of her turbulent relationship with Karolina Zbyszewska. The genre of the novel is also significant. The Hitan is a Gothic novel, thus it employed a convention which Yves Kosowski-Sedgwick described as, quote, one of the first social phenomena and modes of expression in European history in which homosexuality, suppressed, kept secret, and pushed aside, could finally be voiced, end of quote. So employing strategies such as Gothic convention or allusions to ancient Greek culture, visible also in Biała Róza, was Żmichowska's attempt to express non-heteronormative experience under challenging circumstances, connected to more than just conditions of being a queer writer in a 19th century. Being a Polish female author living and creating at the colonized margins of the Russian Empire, Żmichowska faced additional obstacles. She was aware of them and felt stifled by the demands of her era. She complained about the double censorship to a friend in one of her letters, quoting from the letter, "We are under a more terrible shackle than censorship. It is a specific necessity of our position, a firm demand of general opinion that only highly virtuous tendencies, romances, and comedy operas be written. No one, even if they wanted to, would dare, and what is more, from the book publishing business perspective, they would not be able to announce anything immoral in an original way. Hence the result of all slavery, all limitations," end of quote. And perhaps this shackle, worse than Tsarist censorship, Żmichowska wrote about, referred precisely to the circumstances of a colonized nation which demanded every aspect of public life and activities, literature included, to be politicized and directed into the conservation of the national identity and fight for independence. I would argue that in Pavlova's novel, just 2 years after publishing the highly coded autobiographical The Hidden, Żmichowska found a kind of radical, subversive, and empowering potential that became a catalyst for her own work. A catalyst allowing her to imagine, and not only imagine, to write an entirely different story in which she is not only boldly depicted as a successful female author, but also have a glimpse of a scenario in which, at least in fantasy, she could live with another woman in a healthy, supportive, artistically productive, and accepted relationship. I would also argue that the same potential made a double lives author such an important figure among the women writers of the Silver Age era. Pavlova was referenced by Marina Tsvetajeva and Anna Akhmatova. Sofia Parnog and Lyudmila Vilkina-Minskaya dedicated poems to a double lives author, and the importance of Pavlova's influence on the latter evident most of all in Vilkina-Minskaya 1906 volume Moissat was investigated by Kirsty Ekonen. And thanks to the same writers, Russian modernist literature participated in a formative moment of lesbian visibility at the turn of the century in a way unprecedented in the region. This participation is, of course, not an accident, and investigating modernism, Sapphic modernism on the territories of Russian Empire from the transnational perspective reveals that this type of explicit expression was possible only from the position of the imperial colonizing dominant politically and culturally center. While writers representing small literatures were burdened with nation-building tasks, those shackles worse than Tsarist censorship that Żmichowska complained about, women writers from Moscow or Petersburg could allow themselves freedom similar to those who lived and wrote in Paris, London, or Berlin at the time. In Polish literature, after Żmichowska's highly coded novels and the unfinished manuscript of Dwoiste, życie, other attempts to tell a lesbian story came only in 1933. Yet this trajectory of Sapphic modernism could have looked entirely different if only Żmichowska pursued her creative anger triggered by Двойная, жизнь to the end and published Dwoiste, życie in 1848. Thank you very much.
Anna, thank you so much for that incredibly rich paper. We'll go to our собеседник now, Julia Manhart.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Anna for this fantastic and really interesting talk, and also for introducing me to Żmichowska, who I didn't know before, but have enjoyed last week very much in Ursula Phillips' fantastic translation, who I see is here as well. So thank you, both of you. I'm a historian, so I'm not a literary scholar, so I'm saying this just a short warning so you know what direction I'm coming from. But Anna's talks resonated with me in a number of respects, and I want to mention some of them and end with a couple of questions. So what I find very interesting, and possibly also brave about Anna's talk was that she crosses national boundaries, so that she discusses intellectual and literary developments across different languages, although within the imperial space of the Russian Empire. She also makes an important point about the difficulty of making women's voices, and lesbian women's voices in particular, heard during a time of national struggle. So if contemplated from the feminine or the lesbian perspective, this national struggle turns out to be very masculine and demands the subordination of women's needs to its cause. This national struggle thus adds another obstacle to women's agency. And Żmichowska's very explicit comments about this mechanism, I think, force us to problematize the allegedly liberating character of this national struggle and others as well. What resonated also strongly with me as a historian and with my own work was the difficulty that the two writers what these writers depict about the difficulty for women to form groups of solidarity. And historians have pointed out that sort of female sociability in the 19th century, that the boundaries between sort of female friendships and lesbian relationships are sort of fluid, because this is a time where where this idea that lesbianism was sort of a set form of identity had not yet been formed. So ideas about sisterhood relate very closely to ideas about living lesbian lives as well. And the most unsympathetic characters in Pavlova's Двойная жизнь, at least for me, were these mothers who forcefully uphold patriarchy by preventing their daughters from developing interests in anything apart from these superficial conventions and flimsy fashions. And the scheming of these mothers also turns their daughters into rivals on the marriage market, and thus undermines any form of solidarity and friendship that is possible between those two. So in a way, as Anna has argued, this is a very pessimistic depiction of how patriarchal society works. And why this resonated so strongly with me, because I haven't seen something similar in the non-fictional women I'm working on in a number of respects. For one, the evidence that has come down to us through their documents has only evidence that's there through their relationship with men. So what I mean by this is that only letters that women wrote to or about important men have been deemed worthy of archival preservation. But what's even more depressing for us is that in their own writing, these women, when they write about their lives, they conceive their own sense of self only through their relationship with men. Yet, as Anna suggests, Żmichowska found a kindred, albeit distant spirit in Pavlova, and this made it possible for the Polish author to invent a supportive relationship between the two heroines of her double life, a supportive and romantic one. So while Anna, in her conclusion, says that the explicit expression of female sociability, lesbian or otherwise, in particular lesbian, was only possible half a century later from the position of the imperial colonizing and dominant center, it was actually at the imperial periphery that Żmichowska first dreamt of it or first fantasized of it. So my questions are, how do center and periphery matter in this respect? What do we know about the reception of Żmichowska in the work of Russian literary circles? Did the authors of the Sapphic modernist literature know of her work? Were they informed by other peripheral traditions? And a penultimate point, so what sets Żmichowska apart from sort of normal women was also her unmarried status. And Olga Hasty, who I think is here too, has written that, quote, single women have usually been seen through a heteronormative lens, and therefore seen as pathetic, sexless, and lonely failures in a game of heterosexual courtship and marriage, end of quote. But Pavlova describes this marriage as the tragic end of Cecily's stories.
Mhm.
And in real life, too, unmarried women had greater freedoms to pursue their own interests.
Mhm.
Is this freedom of an unmarried life something that Żmichowska or other writers you mentioned develop explicitly? And so my final question is a question about scholarship, about us, I guess. Historian Judith Bennett has written that historians face the challenge of mainstreaming women's history into our discipline's master narrative. And this master narrative is born out of very gendered Victorian enthusiasms, change, progress, politics, high culture, and the deeds of brave men. What strategies do literary scholars pursue to include writers like Żmichowska and Pavlova in the larger narrative? And how straightforward is this for you? It's difficult for us.
To answer your, I think, second question about the Żmichowska's position in this whole trajectory of expression of lesbian experiences through literature, which I only hinted at the ending of my talk, she is actually quite a difficult figure to position within this structure, because as the Dwoiste życie, but also Biała Róza and Poganka, and as you mentioned, that it turns out that this queer potential was tried to be developed in the peripheries, not in the center, right? It only shows how unique writer and person she was, because not only she described this kind of solidarity and looking to other women to be empowered, right, and to find herself as like in Dwoiste życie with Leocadia, who tries to reach to this female author she read in a paper. I probably should have mentioned this broader context, that in her real life, Żmichowska was actually a kind of a founder of an informal group of women friends, most of all friends, who called themselves enthusiasts, enthusiastki, and most of them were this free-minded, free-spirited women. Some of them were married, some of them not. Some of them were writers, some of them were activists, some of them were just wives and mothers, but they were connected with this bonds of sisterhood, and created kind of space of supporting each other, and of accepting each other, and of living their lives as a woman in the 19th century. Actually, it is also a very important context to this portrayal in Dwoiste życie. And as you also as you also noticed, it is sometimes difficult, right, to try to distinguish between close relationships between women in the 19th century, and distinguish between romantic relationships and just close friendships, and partnerships of mutual support, and so on. And in Żmichowska's case, we are lucky enough that in the correspondence of her, and as I mentioned, the corpus of her published correspondence with different people is very big. It's a huge corpus with multiple volumes and so on. We have actual accounts of her, trying to live through the trauma of breaking up with Karolina Żmichowska, who I mentioned when I was talking about Poganka briefly. So Żmichowska actually existed within the both structures, within this enthusiast group, which was a group of friends, and which was bonded by solidarity and pursuits to create a new roles or new forms of female life. And in the second, she had at least one relationship with a woman which was also a very important creative trigger for her writing. So she is quite unique at this regard in the context of the Polish and Russian Eastern European literature, because as I stated before, it was actually only beginning of the 20th century and the Russian poets who started to write openly lesbian poems or novels, such as 33 Abominations by Lidia Zinoviewa-Hannibal and Mój Salt by Ludmila Wilkina-Minskaya, and they were actually when we compare them to the Western authors, French authors who tried to create a modern Lesbos in Paris, in salons in Paris at the beginning of the 20th century, or German and British writers, they are actually pretty common in those in the influences and the language and metaphors that they employ in their work, which is often also drawn from masculine narratives, as you also said. So it is not always seen as a emancipatory discourse, right? So if you were asking if they knew about Żmichowska and read her, I don't think so. I don't think that it would be possible. And even though while Żmichowska was alive, her, for example, relationship with Karolina Zbyszewska was kind of open secret. There were people who knew about that and who could read Poganka knowing what it is about. But at the beginning of the 20th century, I think that those revelations of her queer aspects of her biography were pretty meticulously hidden by this patriotic legend of imprisoned Polish martyr who were living and breathing and writing only to, restore Polish independence and to educate Polish people and to promote Polish culture. Which is not that it is completely untrue, but it is this patriotic facade, as with many other Polish writers from the 19th century, such as Maria Konopnicka, for example, was very strongly erected, and it is very difficult to destabilize and to show different aspects of the same figures. So I'm pretty sure that any of the Russian writers knew about her, and even if they did, I don't think they would draw for the inspirations there when they had French literature, for example. So I hope this answers your second questions. And I think I lost myself, and so if you could repeat again the.
Actually, let's.
I think the answer.
Paper. Let's open.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm sure that we have other questions in the audience. This was really incredibly rich material. So thank you very much, both Anna and Julia. And I'll give it a minute. I actually have a question. It's a kind of general question. So your emphasis is definitely on the painful fact that women outside the imperial metropoles were under particular pressure to conform, not to express sort of deviant forms of love or forms of anything else. Are there any ways in which, there were freedoms outside of the imperial metropoles? Like if you think about, the way the formalists write about, generic innovation, for example, coming more from the periphery and then being incorporated by the center, because there are particular forms maybe of looseness on the periphery. Is there any benefit to being not in the imperial center, or is it just unfortunate? And then after that, I see Helena Gościło had a quick question, but please, Anna.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Well, from my perspective, when I am investigating or looking for the signs of this Sapphic expression in 19th century, it is benefits about being from peripheral margins. Well, what I'm trying to show in my project is and that is, Julia also mentioned it, this simple fact that all of those writers live and wrote actually in the same imperial structure, right? So in the same country, they had the same regulations of state regulations for literature production, such as censorship and so on. But at the same time, they were in a completely different positions in the hierarchy of this, let's say, world literature, World Republic of Literature, as Casanova puts it, right? So Russian literature, which was not only the literature of a colonizer from Polish and Ukrainian standpoint, but it was also much higher in this ladder and much more eager to be incorporated to this world inheritance of culture, right? Polish and Ukrainian literature from the 19th century, not so much. And the writers from those colonized areas had also faced different sets of obstacles, and women in particular had faced different sets of obstacles. I mentioned this nation building tasks, and it is because it is also pretty well researched the role the women writings played in this pursues to build a modern national identity. So, for example, there were Ukrainian writers such as Łesia Ukrainka or Olga Kobylańska is a particularly interesting example, because she started writing in German because she lived in the Austro-Hungarian part of Ukraine. So she, one can say that she could have an access to both cultural areas. She started by trying to enter German modernist, right, spheres, but then she learned Ukrainian and started writing Ukrainian literature because she wanted to create Ukrainian literature. So, and in Polish literature, it is pretty similar. It is that this fact that there was maybe unwritten or unspoken, but yet demand to politicize every aspect of one's life in order to fight for the cause, right? So not only it is much more difficult to write anything that would be more intimate or more individualistic, or about your own experiences as a, for example, woman in a society, when everyone around wants you to write things that will build Polish literature and heritage, but also living in a Priwislański kraj, which was Poland then, Warsaw, where Żmichowska lived for the most of her life, and despite of being local, she was born in Warsaw and died in Warsaw, so it was her city, but it wasn't her city at the same time. She was a citizen of Russian Empire, and within this cohort, she was a minority from Przywislański Kraj. So this adds another layer of difficulty, because if you are already one kind of minority, I imagine it is much more difficult to try to fight for your second minority, minor identity. So I haven't really thought about the benefits, perhaps, and Żmichowska maybe is somehow evidence for that. There were some, but at the time, I think that it's just what is important for me is this intersectional kind of perspective to their position, and which, in my opinion, answers for example, the issue of this lesbian visibility and why it was so vital in Russia at the beginning of 20th century, and is almost absent completely from the other parts.
Great, thank you very much. I saw that Helena Goshiwo had a hand up. Helena, are you still available?
Okay,
Yeah.
I have both comments and questions. The first one concerns the use of Sapphic and lesbian, and I am uneasy about your use of them, and I'll tell you why. I think one needs to define one's terms. When one is talking about the first half of the 19th century. I'm a big fan of Chopin, and in reading letters, one would think he was one of the gayest men around. As it is, he didn't have a very strong sexual drive, but what it was definitely hetero. He would use this moje skarbie, ja cię kocham, etc., 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 his male friends, which I also do, I have to say, to my female friends. When my sister and I walk down the street, we hold hands very often, and young men passing by used to shout, "Hey, honey, I can do it for you better." Okay? So I think you have to be somewhat careful about talking about a period when words had a somewhat different valency. So I would suggest, and we can talk about this more, I would suggest having a look at, if you haven't already, at Adrienne Rich's, her notion of a spectrum, a sexual spectrum, along the horizontal scale. I think it is called, let me get this right, compulsory heteronormativity, where she talks about the fact that, first of all, if there is a sexual love, and this would really matter, especially for Żmichowska, I think, if there is a sexual love, it does not have to be actualized through kissing with the lower lips, so to speak, right? It can be realized through a lifelong commitment, etc., etc. I found Rich, when I was working around the early 19th century, one of the most useful people to consult. So my question ultimately is just what really is the evidence, apart from love and a lyrical expression to women, of Żmichowska's having been lesbian, okay? And it's in some ways a kind of a rhetorical question. My second comment, which will end in a bona fide question, is I think you underplay the conventions of the society tale, the Swiecka powieść, okay? In the 30s, which is when both women were in the formative period, okay? Our book in Russia, Dwoiste, and Nikolai Pavlov's husband, all society tales, but so did women. The society tale is exactly what Pavlova's novel is, except it's a work which is moving toward the novel. So it's a society tale plus, and I see this much more important for that. At its base, I think it's a society tale, but it's already being mobilized towards the novel, which of course would then become big, right, in the late 40s. We see this with Neruda and all sorts of other works, right? Yeah. So my question, and it is a bona fide question, you'll be glad to hear, is did Polish literature have the equivalent of the society tale, which always had the young innocent virgin being married off to a man who was not innocent and not a virgin, very often somebody twice her age, you know, it's the Hollywood spectacle, with a mother who is a pragmatist, who's interested in marrying her daughter off, and so on and so on. I have tons of criticism on this if people are interested. And then what I think of as being, in many ways, fascinating, the answer to all of this actually is, I think, Pushkin's Yevgeny Onegin, where we have part, again, a society tale. And the woman's revenge is her higher morality and her saying F you to the male. And again, I don't think really enough has been done in studying Yevgeny Onegin and the society tale, though it's the Russians who have done this recently. And my question also is, it definitely is not going to be Mickiewicz who has the equivalent of Yevgeny Onegin, though stylistically it might be. Is there a work that you can think of that actually does indeed show that the woman can be stronger than the man, can be married off, as is Tatiana, right? Tatiana has married off at the marriage market, society tale par excellence. But basically says, aha, we're not going to diddle the doodle. Okay? So that's my input.
Okay.
Talking about this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Karolina, for your comments and questions. Well, in context of Świecka Powieść, of course, I just completely skipped on this on the surface of this topic in my talk, because I wasn't sure how long it would take me, and I was given 40 minutes or 45 or so. But the paper of Diane Green I've mentioned, it's a genre and gender in a double life of Karolina Pavlova or something like that. It's a very detailed interpretation of Pavlova's novel, and a very detailed comparison of it to other society tales. And Green also, I think, very convincingly describes the differences and departures of Pavlova's work from the genre of Świecka Powieść. And so I think that she would probably answer this question a lot better than me. So I just took it from her work, but of course I will think about it more later. And of course, in Polish literature, we also had multiple novels with this plotline of young girl who's been married off to a not a virgin and not a honest and a good man, and so on. For example, I think that almost half of Oliza Orzeszkowa's early works are about this, or different variations about this, but well, from the woman's perspective. So yes, there are definitely some examples for that, but I don't have any particular titles from the first half of the 19th century at this moment, to answer that. And coming to Żmichowska, well, I probably just used lesbian as a kind of an umbrella term. I usually use non-heteronormative woman because it is better describing what I'm thinking about it, because actually for me it doesn't really matter if she was bisexual or lesbian or something else, because well, those were of course identities which weren't even defined at that time, but I am pretty confident in saying that she was a non-heteronormative woman or queer woman, and the evidence of her relationship with Karolina Żmichowska, for example, is spread throughout her correspondence. And I would give a second talk only about those letters and only about the details and words which makes me think so confident about this. Because of course I am aware of the 19th century's conventions and epistolary conventions as well, like Żmichowska wrote "Całuję ząbki," czyli that is I kiss in your teeth to almost every of her friends from the enthusiast circle. But there are differences in the way she writes about Karolina Żmichowska, and for me there are the evidence is there, but I just didn't have a time to give bigger case about it, because in this talk it was not that relevant, I think. So hopefully for this time you can well, trust me, and we can talk about it. Of course, later. And the lesbian Sapphic terms, which I use almost exchangeably, but not really, because in my larger project, when I mostly use the term Sapphic, what is really interesting to me, it's not really the, for example, orientation of the writer, because sometimes it aligns with their work, like in Żmichowska's case, sometimes it doesn't at all. But what interests me, it's not their biographies itself, is the way they try to tell a story about the Sapphic love, or to try portray a Sapphic non-heteronormative character in the literature, which wasn't there before. So I'm hoping that it's good enough for now, at least.
Dziękuję, do zobaczenia.
Do zobaczenia.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Helena. We have a question from Andy Gulnev, or Gulnov, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. I had some difficulties turning on the sound. So yes, thank you very much for this opportunity to ask a question. And I go by Andy Gulnev or Gulnov, whichever you like. So the question is, was this literary work a founding cornerstone for the LGBTQ literature in Poland? Was it a one-off or a beginning of a new literary tradition? So how is it situated within those who were before and after? And then secondly, as for the readers, it would really be very interesting to know if it has reached the communities like right there in the 19th century, or was delayed, if it was delayed until the 1920s, right? Because we know that there was some tradition of circulation of the prohibited literature, even in the Russian Empire. If we remember the bell from being, shipped from outside, and works of Gertsen and others. So would you perhaps elaborate why it was not, or why it was possible to see similar things happening in the underground for this work, and whether actually the LGBTQ flavor of the topic, of the theme, influenced some restrictions in terms of availability of this work for the public back then in the 19th century. So what was the core reason why it was confiscated and prohibited? Well, it appears, it seems like it was the LGBT thing, but I would really like to hear your perspective, because on the other hand, there were also examples how prohibited literature was still read and was still available in the empire. Thank you very much.
Well, about the founding stone of Polish LGBT literature, unfortunately, it wasn't. And well, the building of like, let's say, canon of Polish queer literature is actually pretty recent process, which started like a couple of decades ago, and it lately reached a huge milestone because Błażej Warkocki, Tomasz Amenda, and Tomasz Kaliściak and Alessandro Amenda published this huge 1,000-page long anthology of Polish queer literature spanning from the end of the 18th century to the contemporary times, and it was published in 2020, so it is a pretty recent moment in a Polish history of reading LGBTQ literature. So so before that it wasn't really easy to find a founding stone, for example, for literature like this. And moreover, in Polish queer studies, it is changing lately, but for the beginning of it, from the late 90s and the beginning of 2000s, it was really very masculine narration. It was there were scholars who actually portrayed Polish queer literature as masculine tradition, and they, for example, there were some mentions of Żmichowska, for example, but they were really marginal. And I have my favorite that put in his whole huge book about Polish literature and homosexuality, mentioned Żmichowska only once in a footnote, and he wrote that there were some feminist scholars that found vestigial traces of Sapphic or lesbian motifs in Żmichowska's writing, but yeah, they were vestigial. But if you really read Żmichowska's work and read Biała Róza, read Poganka, read her letters, it turns out that what was called vestigial in her case, for example, in case of I don't know, Jarosław Iwaszkiewicz, was called this revolutionary, subversive queer literature and, well, founding stone, for example, of Polish LGBTQ tradition. So the gender gap and gender perspective is also very important here. And it's not only a case of Polish queer studies, of course. We see this situation repeating multiple times in every other cultural space that develops, for example, queer studies, but it's just only happening now in Poland, right? So, but when you think, and I think that you asked also about it, about the people from the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century, quite important was work done by Tadeusz Wojzieleński that I was talking about briefly also, who not only tried to introduce his contemporaries to Żmichowska's work and publish oral novels and so on, but most of all, he wrote a couple of biographical essays about her, in which he deciphers Poganka as a queer novel that tells a story of her Żmichowska's relationship with Paulina Zbyszewska. So it was pretty early when the efforts of queering Żmichowska's life and work were undertaken. So so it is an important case. But as for now, I'm not really aware if she was any kind of source of inspiration or open source of inspiration for other writers in this matter. I think that she was more like this soul figure, you know, which is there, but it doesn't really started a new wave, for example. I hope that this answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you. We're coming to the end, but I think that we have time for one more question. Ursula Phillips has a question.
Well, thank you very, very much. I'm really delighted that somebody is taking these issues further, because, you know, I wrote about various aspects of Żmichowska some time ago, as did Borkowska. But very few people have actually taken it up as seriously as you have. So I'm delighted to hear all this. Now, I have a few comments. I'll keep it very brief. First of all, I just wanted to raise the fact that there was a third White Rose text, which is called Ustęp Białej Rózy, which was discovered by Piotr Chmielewski and was published in the collected works of Żmichowska in 1885 or 6, whenever it was, which actually takes the story of the next White Rose, Augusta, who grew out of Leocadia, to a point where, you know, Helena was asking about, is there a character that actually rejects this marriage sort of syndrome? Well, Augusta very much does in this. And I would also say that the homoerotic elements in that third text are much more evident than they are in the earlier two. That's my first comment. My second comment is about the enthusiasts. Now, the group that were called the enthusiasts in the 1840s were not just women. There was a large group of young people who were very left-wing, you know, socialists before socialism, Marxists before Marxism, you know, who were associated with the journal Przegląd Naukowy, the scientific. I'm thinking of Edward Dębowski, who was nicknamed the Red Baron, and Skimborowicz, who was obviously the husband of one of the so-called enthusiasts. And when she wrote about them later, of course, Żmichowska did identify mainly the women, but at the time there were men as well. And all that ended with the 1848, you know, uprising and then the suppression and the imprisonment of Żmichowska. But, you know, later on in life, in the 1850s, when she came back to Warsaw, when she was released, she was employed by the Grabowskis in their school on Miodowa. And that's where the next group of, I would say, much more feminist kind of young women developed, the Grabowski sisters, and Wanda Grabowska was, of course, the mother of Wojciechowski, mother. And she was convinced that there was, he was convinced that there was something of this nature between his mother and Żmichowska. So that relation was very close. And if I remember correctly, Żmichowska was also his godmother, wasn't she? I think so. Anyway, that was that. So we need to distinguish between those two groups.
Yeah.
There were two different groups. And my third question is a bit speculative, but I'm still wondering whether there is any proof, whether you've actually found any evidence that she did actually read Pavlova's novel. I mean, I tend to agree with you that I think there's enough sort of circumstantial evidence to suggest that she did, and her interpretation certainly goes in that direction. But I wonder, and I've often wondered about this, and I'm going to risk it now, that the metaphor of the white rose is the thing that maybe proves it, because I was looking at the novel again, and I haven't got the Russian here, but I've got Barbara Helt's translation, and on page 55 we have this sentence. If I quickly read it. Olga, in a white dress of exceedingly expensive simplicity, with cornflowers in her long blonde curl, was astonishingly lovely. But Cecily, who was also in white, with a crown of white roses set over her proud black braids, was even lovelier. I've often wondered whether that was where this metaphor comes from. This crown of white roses, which also, of course, looks forward to the final image of Cecilia, where she's getting married and she's got this heavy, burdensome crown. Anyway, that's it. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ursula, for being here, of course, and providing this additional very important context. As for the proof of Żmichowska actually reading Pavlova, well, I think that you also gave an final proof that could be found, because unfortunately, where I was looking for it, it was, of course, Żmichowska's correspondence. And there is no mention of Pavlova anywhere, not in the 1840s or later. But I think, and I'm wondering if you would agree with me, well, it's because she's Russian, even if she read her and she loves her novel, she wouldn't, be writing to her friends that, oh, I just read this great Russian woman writer, because, well, it wasn't in a good taste. Right. Of course, there were some exceptions, like Pushkin, for example. I think that there were writers that wouldn't be, afraid to admit that they read Pushkin. But this, well, for me, the fact that Żmichowska doesn't mention her in her, for example, letters or elsewhere, doesn't prove that it wasn't there. No, and yes, and my arguments are, of course, circumstantial, but I think that in a literary history, and especially in comparative studies, you come to a point when those I lost the word. When the level of coincidence and similarities is too high to be dismissed. So, like, there are, of course, very similar details as with this white rose and other things. Like I believe that, for example, the friend of Kazimiera, or the narrator from Dwoiste, życie, has very similar features as Olga from Dwoiste, życie. She is also described as very witty woman, and so on. And there are many details that are similar in both novels. When I just tried to look at them from the greater distance to gather things that I think are essentially similar between them. And in this way, for me, it shows that it couldn't be a coincidence. It's because it was the same time, and the same
very close.
And the sole fact of the title, Dwoiste życie, it's really not a natural way to say a double life in Polish language, but it surely sounds more familiar to Двойная, жизнь in Russian. So if I ever find any solid proof, I will let you know. I will let you know, of course. And as for the ustęp, which was added by Chmielewski in the 80s after Żmichowska had died.
Yep.
Well,
collected works.
Yes, Biała Róza and many other Żmichowska's works are very difficult for editors, for example, because how do you decide what is the fragment of the novel and what isn't? Because even Żmichowska seems to have troubles with that. Like with Poganka, it was firstly published in the Przegląd Naukowy without the prologue and this whole frame. Which
that's
is
another
very
issue.
Important, yeah. And
Well, it was written at the same time.
Yeah, and later when she published this novel separately, there is this whole new narrative structure that contains the original Poganka. And with Ustęp, I think that it needs a more closely reading from me. I'm not sure if I would agree with you that it is even more obviously.
Well, I think it is. Well, what's the question?
We can talk about it. Than Dwoiste życie, than those fragments of Dwoiste życie, especially those fragments where Leocadia describes her fantasy life with the author. But of course, it is also there, and moreover, it resembles this. Pavlova's work in the way that the action of this ustęp takes place in a boudoir, right? So it is this intimate woman, intimate space in which the heroine could be like more of herself without this corset that society puts on her. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. And we have gone over time since the talk was so wonderful. The comments were wonderful, and thank you very much for the discussion. We hope to see you again in a couple of weeks at the next 19V. This has been really great, and happy spring to everyone. Thank you, Anna and Julia. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for having me and for all of the great comments. And it was great to see you.